Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel. I do hope you're all doing remarkably well. Loads and loads of love to you all. And I just hope you're having a fabulous time as the weather gets warmer. Don't forget to get that lovely hot cup of coffee or tea, because even in hot weather, you can always be refreshed with a good hot drink or something nice and cold. So before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up. And let's get started with tonight's story. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Barry and I was born and raised in Tennessee, which is the southern part of the United States and considered part of Appalachia. I grew up in a charming wooden cabin that had been made from mature timber beams and had been passed down to us through the generations on my father's side of the family, and it came with a sizable plot of pristine-looking land. The cabin was one of those indestructible, sturdy homes that could withstand a lot of wear and tear, and so it was ideal for us growing up, given that we were rambunctious, hyperactive children that were rather predisposed to breaking almost everything we touched. Appalachia is an exquisitely beautiful part of the world, as anyone will ever tell you. And if you grow up here, you become so attached to the mountains, forests, lakes and scenic vistas, so much so that they almost become an intrinsic part of you. Growing up, our property consisted of emerald green rolling hills, a pretty flowery prairie, a large silvery pond, and a sizable barn, all heavily flanked by a vast area of forest consisting of oaks, maples and dogwoods, which was a haven for indigenous wildlife from squirrels, foxes and raccoons, and was also accessible to the public with footpaths and large hiking trails. Needless to say, given the fact that this wood green was almost an extension of our own property, as kids we considered it as such, and it was our special place where we would play all kinds of games from cops and robbers to hide and seek. I grew up in the 50s and it was a time when things were looking rather promising for Americans as the economy boomed under President Eisenhower. But the problem was that some people in our neck of the woods were still caught up in the poverty trap, and regretfully my family was one of those people. In the early years of the 50s, that is. Even though in many respects I had what I can only describe as an enviable, idyllic childhood, in its incipience life was hard for us as a family, and we struggled to get by financially, as money was always wanting and in short supply. Unfortunately, money was the one commodity that both my parents argued about day and night unfailingly. Their yelling voices were a prelude of a great distress for my brother and I in the early years. "I hate you," my mother would yell. "You have no idea how hard it is with two young kids to raise. And you have the brass neck to accuse me of being wasteful. How dare you? Do you know how expensive it is to feed those two boys of ours?" "But I see you brought yourself a brand new dress today," screamed my father. "You have enough clothes already, and you go wasting our money on frivolous, extravagant things like this that we can ill afford." "Frivolous," my mother would scream. "How dare you? When last did I buy myself something nice? Do you know how humiliating it is to go to church every single Sunday wearing exactly the same dress over and over again, and have the people look at you with piteous expressions on their faces? It's downright embarrassing, that's what it is. And pardon me for having a little pride." "Oh, so you're being humiliated for wearing the same dress again means that you're willing to go throwing my money to the wind." "You don't understand what it's like to be a woman," cried my mother. "You're right. I don't understand. You're willing to put pride over our family's needs. Now that is disgusting and exceedingly selfish." There were times my brother and I would put our hands over our ears and beg the unceasing arguing to just please stop. "I wish they'd shut up," I'd say to my brother. "I wish they'd stop droning on and on about money all the time. I really think they should realise how lucky we are to have each other. After all, isn't that what really counts?" "I'm not sure Mum understands that," said my brother. "It would seem that image is so much more important to her than what our family actually needs." "I think you're being unkind and judging Mum way too harshly," I said. "What's wrong for a woman to want a few nice things? I do get where she's actually coming from." One day my mother came into our bedroom and sat on our beds, reaching out for both of our hands to hold. I was dismayed to discern how red she appeared around the eyes, and also to discern that she had a long stream of tears pouring down her pink cheeks. It was not like her to look this sorrowful, downhearted and miserable. What was wrong, I wondered? Had something dreadful happened? I have something terrible to tell you, she told us, and I'm not sure I have the heart to tell you about it, but it seems that I must. Are you getting a divorce? I asked quickly. Oh, nothing like that, she told us. Why on earth would you think such an awful thing? Your father and I have our differences, granted, and occasional altercations, but we do love each other very much. It doesn't seem like that, I said. You're always quarrelling. My mother looked dumbfounded and appalled. Is that what you kids really think? You believe your father and I are unhappy together? Yes, we do. Because you always fight, my brother exclaimed. Oh dear, said my mother, looking at us earnestly. I think your father and I should be ashamed of ourselves. I can see that we've caused a great deal of bother and dismay to the both of you, with our incessant arguing, which has got to stop. Do you realise how much I love and treasure you both? I don't think I tell you enough, and it's times like this when you realise how valuable and precious your loved ones really are. Tell me, boys, how would you like to have another brother? You're pregnant? I asked, looking shocked. This was not what I wanted to hear. Is that why you're upset? You don't want another kid because you won't be able to buy more dresses for yourself? My mother looked visibly troubled and disquieted by my words. No, to all your questions, my mother said, wiping her tears away with her hands and blowing her nose very hard. I have a very regretful, sad story to have to tell you. My sister and her husband were found dead this morning, as they were attacked and killed by a savage bear. Your cousin Marty is coming to live with us, and we are going to adopt him as our very own child. The good news is he's about your age, so you'll have another brother. How do you feel about that? Not good, I said honestly. If you fight about how expensive we are to raise, it's going to be 1,000 times worse when there are 3 of us. I think you'll find you're wrong about that, said my mother, kissing me tenderly on the cheek. If there is a rosy lining to this dreadful saga, my sister and her husband had a little money, and that's going to make a very big difference to transform our lives for the better, which means your father and I are going to be a lot less apprehensive about money. But more significantly of all, it really makes me realise what is important in life, and that is our beautiful family. And so it was that my cousin Marty came to live with us. I'd never really liked him very much, as he was a very quiet, withdrawn kid, and somewhat of a social misfit that kept himself to himself and never interacted with any of the other kids. The quintessential nerd, so to speak, that was not cool to be seen hanging around with at school, and now he was becoming my brother. Could things get any worse than that? I didn't think so. Needless to say, I wasn't looking forward to his unwelcome presence in our home, and I knew my brother felt exactly the same way as I did, only he was far too nice to express his misgivings, unlike me. Now, you're both to be very kind to your cousin Marty, my mother insisted. You must remember he's grieving a very tragic loss. You would do well to talk to him about what happened to his parents. The social worker told us that it will help him to heal a great deal, and it's much better for someone his own age to commiserate with him about the tragedy. What if I don't want to? I said to my mother. I don't even like Marty. Now, don't you go talking like that about Marty and dismissing him out of hand. It's wrong to judge your cousin so indiscriminately, with such bull-headed prejudice, without giving him a second chance. My parents were walking on eggshells, and I'm not kidding you about that, to appease him and make him feel welcome, loved and wanted. You could tell that they would move heaven and earth for him. They were terrified to upset him in any way. Are you all right, Marty? They would say. Is everything okay, Marty? Are you all right, Marty? It would seem like our house had become as airy as a morgue, as quiet as a church, and as dull and lifeless as a cemetery. For a moment I almost wished my parents would begin to fight and argue again, so that we could banish and abolish the drone-like monotony of the silence, and rekindle some kind of lively spark in our sombre, gloomy, depressed, dismal and colourless home. I told you that I'm not as nice as my brother, and that was proved one day when I'd had quite enough, and in my growing sense of frustration and infuriation I actually punched Marty so very hard that he began to sob and sob like a baby. I couldn't restrain myself from punching him over and over again till he sobbed more and more. I was so relieved to see that there was some kind of life in the seemingly soulless boy. My mother was absolutely furious with me and said, "What are you doing, you stupid boy? Can't you see? Marty's grieving. How can you be so insensitive and cruel?" It would seem that punching Marty was the best thing I could have ever done for him, because he cried and he cried until his tears had all dried up and he could cry no more. After he'd been punched and pounded by me within an inch of his life, Marty began to talk. "I suppose you think I'm a big baby," he said. "Yes, I do," I told him. "I'm not going to lie to you to make you feel good about yourself, just because your parents are dead, just like everybody else does. Yes, I do feel sorry for you, but I'm not going to give you any special treatment." "I don't want you to," he said. "I'm sorry, though," I said in a moment of surprising compassion. "Of course I am that you've lost your parents to a bear attack. It must have been awful for you, and I mean that very sincerely. I am sorry." "It wasn't a bear that killed my parents," insisted Marty. "That's what the police say. I tried to tell them what it was, but they wouldn't listen. They just thought I was a silly little boy, so they refused to listen to anything I had to say." "Well, if it wasn't a bear," I said sarcastically, "what was it then? A bobcat? A mountain lion?" "It was a wild man," said Marty. "He was built like a giant. He was the size of 5 or 6 men, and he was covered in long hair." "Don't be ridiculous," I scoffed. "Are you having a laugh? Because it's not funny, Marty." "Do I look like I'm laughing?" he said. "I think he's telling us the truth, Barry," said my brother. "Give him a break. Why don't you tell us your story, Marty?" he encouraged. "I'm not sure you would believe it if I did tell you," said Marty, sounding ominously like he was going to clam up. "Why don't you try us, Marty?" I said. "I'm all ears." This was the astonishing story that Marty told us. "One day my father went hunting in the wood green near our home. I remember it was an exquisitely beautiful summer's day. There had been reports by the locals of a large bear seen loitering in the woods, so my father was eager to take it down. He really wanted the magnificent pelt, and he liked the idea of having the bear's head mounted upon our wall like a proud trophy. He regularly hunted in the area and was considered an excellent shot. So he ventured into the woods on his own, and when he left he was in a great mood because he was whistling happily to himself. He told us that on this particular occasion the woodgrove seemed to take on a very menacing ambience, becoming chillingly spooky and very sinister. He got the distinct impression that he was being scrutinised by very malicious, unseen eyes. He said his gut was telling him to leave now, but the very thought of acquiring the bear head outweighed his desire to listen to the inner warning voice within, telling him to quit while he was ahead. He really regretted not listening to that voice. That was when he saw a black bear stealthily walking through the brush, and he took aim and fired a couple of shots at the creature, and the bear unleashed the most terrifying, appalling, discomposing scream, and then flopped to the ground dead. My father said he'd never heard a bear cry out like that before, and it sent a chill down his spine. When he ambled over to the creature, he realised to his horror that he had killed a man, but a man that was wild and covered in hair, built like a massive giant. He said this thing was so gargantuan in size, easily over 8 foot tall, with a barrel-like torso, overlong arms, short powerful legs, and a very human face with a beard and moustache. From the back, my father had assumed that this was a bear. He said he felt a terrible sense of shame overcome him. He said it was like he had murdered someone in cold blood, because this thing, whatever it was, appeared remarkably human. He said he looked down at the body and began to profusely apologise to the corpse, saying how dreadfully sorry he was for what he'd done. He was incredibly distressed and troubled that he ran home to tell my mother what had transpired, and my mother begged him to show her the strange body, because the story sounded so incredulous, and she was eager to see what the wild man looked like for herself. My father eagerly took my mother to the woods, and the body of the wild man had completely disappeared, and my father could not fathom where it had got to. I mean, the man weighed over 700 pounds. Who could have lifted it? But someone or something had indeed done so. For a while the forest was filled with pretty birdsong, but that suddenly dissipated, and both my parents began to get the terrifying impression that they were not alone and were being watched. My mother told me that she'd never felt such a foreboding trepidation like that before. She described it as so chilling that her blood turned icy cold, so much so that there were goosebumps on her arm. She turned around to my father and said, "Something is not right about this place. We are being studied by menacing eyes. We need to get out of here, and fast." All of a sudden they heard the most dreadful roaring sound. My mother said it was worse than the sound of a lion, because the ground literally vibrated under its god-awful velocity, and it reverberated through her chest violently. My mother started to run for her life, but my father told her to slow down, because if she ran, the predator hiding in the brush would be more than likely to pursue her and hunt her down. As my parents retreated through the wood green, they heard something bipedal and big following them. My mother said you could hear heavy feet pressing down foliage and crunching down twigs, and when they stopped, so did the footsteps behind them. But when they moved ever forwards, so did the feet begin crunching the leaf litter again. They guessed at once it must be a wild man of some kind following them, like the one my father had killed, and they were so scared that the critter might want to extract its revenge on them, especially if it knew my father had killed one of its kind. I remember my parents discussed everything vigilantly over dinner, and they told me to avoid visiting the woods because of what my father had done. They believed that they had been followed by another one of these wild men who might be trying to seek revenge on behalf of its fallen comrade. It was something my parents considered as a very distinct possibility, which was why we decided to go away for a couple of weeks for a brief holiday. It was to be the last holiday we ever had together as a family. Well, when we returned home, our house was a complete and total shambles. It was as if someone had torn down the front door violently, and all our things had been flung haphazardly all over the place. Even the filling in the sofas had been torn out and was scattered in pieces of cotton wool all over the floor. Our mattresses were also shredded apart, and drawers had been thrown all over the place, with clothes flung everywhere. It looked almost as if our house had been broken into by a drug squad in a police raid. "So you did call the police?" I asked. "Of course," said Marty, and even they admitted it looked like a police drug raid because something or someone was looking for something in our home, but they said it looked as if the front door had been broken down by a mighty force of some kind. "Did your parents think it was a wild man?" I asked. It did cross their mind, but it was the way that the things had been gone through that led them to believe that the break-in was of human origin. But now I'm not so sure about that. Anyway, after my parents returned home, things began to settle down to normal again, and we even fitted a brand new front door. About 2 days later, we awoke in the middle of the night to hear stones being flung at our home, and they were breaking windows and causing a substantial damage to the walls and the roof. That was when we saw a wild man through the window. It was a full moon that night, and the outside light was on, so we could see him very clearly. I've never seen anything look so furious or disgruntled in all my life. It was clear this anguished critter wanted blood, and it would not be happy until we were all dead, because my father had killed its friend, and it was seeking vengeance. That seemed clear. Perhaps it didn't understand it was a mistake, I suggested. Maybe if it had known you were aggrieved about what had happened and felt remorseful, it would have not been so reactive and affronted. Well, what could my parents do about it? It was not as if they could talk to the critter. It wouldn't even speak our language. So what did he do? I asked. Your father, I mean. Well, my dad became incensed with the critter, and my mother suggested he calm down immediately and call the sheriff before he did something foolish that he would later regret. My mother warned him wisely that he could not take the critter down on his own accord, because he was no match for this wild man. But my father was stubborn and obstinate, and refused to listen. On the contrary, I perceived my mother's words seemed to fire up my father, and he said, "You don't think I can take the wild man down myself? You want a bet?" He then stormed out of the house, looking as explosive and volatile as the critter himself, and he ran towards the critter intentionally and began to scream at it. "How dare you throw stones at my house? "What do you think you're doing?" He was so mad, and he was firing warning shots into the air. In truth, he almost looked manic the way he was behaving. While my mother was watching this unfold, tears of regret were pouring down her face. "Your father is a complete idiot," she said. "What is he thinking?" She began to grab the phone to call the sheriff, but dropped the receiver when she saw the critter had grabbed my dad's gun, thrown it on the roof, and was now tossing my father in the air like a frisbee, where he landed on the concrete cement with a mighty smash. I promise you my dad looked like a fragile mannequin in the wild man's monstrous hands. My mother grabbed a frying pan from the kitchen. She had lost all her fear, and she began chasing the critter, screaming, "Leave my husband alone!" I think she knew in that moment that my dad was dead, and somehow she lost her fear because she was so enraged, and she ran boldly after the creature. The next thing I knew, my mother was being flung 10 foot into the air and went crashing to the cement floor like my father had done. They both lay on the ground dead. In seconds, I had lost both my parents. I remember racing out to my parents' bodies, and I began to sob uncontrollably as I clutched my mother's dead arm in my hand. The critter watched me. He didn't say a thing. He just observed me for a while, and then glided away. He didn't even attempt to attack me. "What did you tell the police?" I asked. Well, I started to tell the officer my story, but he didn't believe a word of it. He said, "I've got to hand it to you, son. You have a wild imagination, and you can tell a very good story. But you and I know it was a bear that did this." He then said, "Son, a word of advice. Don't tell anyone what you've told me. They might think you've lost your marbles." What a cheek, I said, finding myself feeling strangely protective towards Marty. Even I knew you were telling the truth. "So do I," said my brother. "Thanks," said Marty, his eyes filling with tears. "That means a whole lot." From that moment on, I had a whole new respect for Marty, now that I understood what he'd been through, and I began to see him through brand new eyes, and before long I considered him like a brother to me. After Marty moved into our home, things did improve dramatically, as my parents made a conscious effort not to fight anymore, and it did help having more money. Life was definitely optimised for all of us. I also think that my mother, having inherited her sister's beautiful wardrobe of clothes and always looking so glamorous for church, really did feel more confident about herself. One day our teacher at school invited a Native American medicine man to speak to our class informally on traditional medicine and the power of plants and their healing benefits, and this man made a casual reference to the wild men of the woods. After he'd spoken to the class, I asked if I could speak to him during recess, and he had agreed. That was when I told him Marty's story and the terrible fate that became his parents. "This is a very sad story indeed," said the medicine man. "The Native Americans knew how to respect the wild man, but your culture has misunderstood him, and that is where the problems arise. They cause conflict and discord. You must perform a healing ceremony in the woods near your home, and you need to sit in a closed circle holding hands together, and I want you to burn some sage in the middle of this circle. We call this smudging as it helps to remove the negative energy. You all need to close your eyes and call upon the great spirit of the wild man. You have to seek their forgiveness, or the bad energy will cloud Marty's life forever and never leave, and his life on this earth plane will be very short indeed. After the ceremony is complete, you need to leave a basket of fruit outside the forest as a gift. Our people always did this for the guardian of the forest, and this is a sign of great respect and honour. How will we know if the great spirit of the wild man has forgiven him? I asked the medicine man. Oh, believe me, you will know. And so it was that Marty, my brother, and I sat together in a circle, holding hands and smudging the circle with the sage to clear away the negative energy. We closed our eyes and called upon the spirit of the wild man, and we quietly confessed our apologies and asked for forgiveness. I felt something, Marty told me after the ceremony. It was like a peace came over me, and a heaviness was lifted. The following night we all went to sleep, and all three of us compared notes, and it came to light that we'd all had exactly the same dream. We dreamed that an eagle had perched upon our hands and pecked out a feather from its wing, and flown off, leaving us with a single feather. It seemed nonsensical that we all had the identical dream. But things became weirder still when my mother entered our bedroom holding up 3 eagle feathers in her hands. I mean, how is that even possible? Could dreams have real-life consequences in our lives, I wondered. It would seem they have more power than we could ever imagine. You will never believe what happened this morning, my mother said. I opened the front door and there were 3 eagle feathers lying on the doorstep. And if that wasn't odd enough, there was also a bald eagle soaring above our cabin. I couldn't believe it, she said. It was such a spiritual experience. I felt as if I was connecting with that eagle somehow. I think the feathers are for us, I told my mother. How funny, she said. That's exactly what I assumed. She handed them to me. Isn't that odd, she said, walking away. I handed my brother their feathers, and we agreed that this was a sign that we had been forgiven. And I still have my feather today, and it means the world to me. And as for Bigfoot, my impressions of him are only of the good kind. So there you are. That's my story. Wow, what an amazing story. And if you liked it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Until next time, goodbye and good night.